Some of you all know me as the guy on the point at the end of the hairpin and Fairpoint with standing on the road with a pair of binoculars every morning. If you know me that way, you know me as a bird watcher. And we are birders. And we're going to give you a little spiel about birds first since we're waiting for this other thing. And you may not know it, but Gulf Breeze has a nationwide reputation as a haven for birds. It's known throughout the state as one of the places to see birds. Most of the places down my way are all private, so you don't see a lot of bird watchers going down there. But it's a migrant trap, and when birds are crossing the Gulf, and they're in trouble. They cross the Gulf, they've flown all night, they've used their energy, and they put down at the first land they come to, and where is that? It's either Fort Pickett or Gulf Breeze, and down at the point where we live especially. And so our yard list has the honor of being fourth in North America in the number of species seen from 1 yard. 294 species seen from 1 yard. But that's 50 years of birding. So,
it seems that we sort of started this thing with birding, like with many other things. There can be a competitive element. And it's science-based, but it's also, there's a little bit of competition sometimes. And one of the editors of one of the major journals was visiting with us, and he was just kind of blown away with the number of birds we had in the yard. And he says, well, how many birds do you think you have in the yard? Not individuals, but I'm talking about individual species, like a blue jay is one, a cardinal is another one, and titmouse is another, and so forth. In fact, each of you probably knows a lot more about birds than you think you do, because you recognize a lot of these birds. And so, if you were to start making a list and tallying it up, I'll bet you that you would come up with probably 15 to 20 birds that you actually know. And so, this fellow who was visiting with us, actually it was three different scientists who were with us at the time, and they said, well, how many? Well, when we told them, they were just absolutely blown away. Well, Paul Lehman, who was the editor of the journal, he says, I think I can beat that. So he went out to California and he bought a place at the south end of San Francisco Bay. And it didn't take him too long before, it took him about 10 to 12 years before he caught up with us. And then a fellow in Galveston, Texas did the same thing. And then the guy who went to California, he says, oh, I can do better than California. He went to Cape May, New Jersey. So all three of those places have beat us as far as numbers, but I'll bet you we've got no rare birds. And a few rare birds in this audience too, I bet. But at any rate, it's a lifelong passion, and it's the type of a hobby that anybody can do anywhere. At your kitchen window, looking out at your yard, or going on a walk with the Audubon chapter, which I will say I'm the field trip leader. At any rate, you can take it to many different levels, and I would like to invite you anytime that you would like to check out our Audubon Society website. If you were to Google Audubon in Pensacola, you can find us. It's the Francis M. Weston Audubon Society.
And we just published our third bird book, The Birds of the Kansas and Oklahoma Counties, if anyone's interested. We have it here tonight. We didn't come here to talk about birds, we came to talk about history.
I got a count of the spoon.
You did.
Remember the pink bird that was
Yes.
off of the flamingo?
Yeah.
I think your name is in the book.
Is it?
Well, when was this?
Not that long ago, a couple years ago. It was the Blue Angels that we were watching, and a friend of mine said, is that a pink bird? And he was flying off the Piscataway Beach.
You might have told us that after we went to press on that, but it's easy enough to find out. But anyway, the book is put together, and the data is put together by people who see things and document it, and you can document document things either with a photograph, you can document things with a recording, or with a very good description. And, page 52. Yeah, it was,
Bob, how about fallout? Because I've never
your
heard
name
of
is
it.
not in.
I'm not in there.
Sorry.
That's all right.
You're asking, what is a
It's
fallout?
about, yeah.
Fallout is when the birds have been flying all night, they're crossing the Gulf. Cold front gets in the northern Gulf, torrential rain, they get wet, you have casualties, some birds are falling into the Gulf. And they get to the first land and they're all coming down at once. And if you're there, it is paradise. It's hell for birds, but paradise.
And that happens on Pensacola Beach, right?
It happens not only in Pensacola Beach, particularly where there are woodland areas, like at Fort Pickens, and then at woodland areas here in Gulf Breeze. And if you look at an aerial view of Gulf Breeze, you see quite a lot of wooded land. And unfortunately, though, much of what you see is not native vegetation. And birds evolved with native vegetation. The vegetation evolved hand in hand with native species of arthropods, insects. And so when you have if you have a yard that's all horticulturally planted, you aren't going to have the native insects, and therefore you're not going to have the birds, for example, that we have. Those of you who know our yard know it's very wooded. And so birds, I could do it how well this stuff.
We'll come back and speak again.
Yeah.
What has happened to the migration of autumn? As I remember in '78, you could practically not see the ground for so many robins. And I haven't seen that kind of thing since.
Well, robins do migrate down in the wintertime and spend the winter down here. Now keep in mind, a bird is going to conserve energy as much as possible. So if he's finding food north of here, he doesn't have to spend another time flying all the way down to the coastal area to Gulf Breeze. And so we do have scores and scads of robins, but sometimes they do come and push all the way down to the coast, and sometimes they don't. If you're looking for robins in January, go drive some farmland up in the north end of the county and you'll see thousands of them. So they're doing fine.
Can you tell me the season for the red garden?
They're here year-round. They're residents, they breed here. In fact, the birds have had a fantastic breeding year this year. It's typical in our yard at any one time around the feeders, 15 cardinals.
I've seen a lot in my yard.
Yeah.
With a lady, she wants to go and then we're here. And I walk my dog to the rec center, and I haven't seen any.
Because you're starting.
I'm sorry, what?
People can leave if they have to.
Very few
They're migrating now.
here.
There are
You know,
thousands of them around
You go east on our peninsula, where the peninsula gets wider, you find more hummingbirds. But hummingbirds we have in Gulf Breeze more in spring migration and in fall migration. And so I have a friend who just told me the other day, oh, I saw a hummingbird. So that's an early bird. But you can start looking for hummingbirds in August, and you will have them through the end of October. The only species that breeds east of the Mississippi is the ruby-throated hummingbird. However, after the end of October, if you have a hummingbird feeder out, and if you have a hummingbird at your feeder November through about the end of March, get in touch with us because you probably have a very rare species. The species that comes from western Texas.
Talking about birds. We're talking about birds, I got a story
everybody, you know what I mean?
I have been told by some people that I dearly love that my voice is
It does.
No, it's not. But I mean,
Let's, if everybody would pay attention, because we're missing out on some neat information. Okay.
Well, I think somebody had a question they wanted to ask.
Good. Okay, we're going to get ahead of ourselves here because we don't have the program ready yet. And I'm going to tell you a story that's been passed down to me from my father. It was a story that I really had reservations about whether or not it was true. Because, you know, way back, people told stories to their kids because there was no TV or radio. And this story was told to me, and I was not quite sure that it was true, but my father told it to me, and we're going to have to go back to about 1915. In 1915, here in Gulf Breeze, there were 3 houses. They were all Duncan houses. One was at Hoffman Bayou, what's called Hoffman Bayou now, which my people call the Lake House. That was the first house built in Gulf Breeze after the Duncans got a land grant. But we'll go into that later. There was another house on the point down there where we live on Peace Point. There was another Duncan house, and there was one other house halfway between, which would be roughly to the north of our cemetery. That was where Uncle Dallas lived. Uncle Dallas lost his wife and he was a little child, about my father's age at the time, if it were about 1915, because my father was 5 or 6 years old. Now bear in mind, there was no electricity, when the sun went down, you went to bed. You sat on the porch. The house was set back in the woods, so it couldn't be seen from the water if there was no electricity, no lights. And my father tells me this story because he was there as a child. Uncle Dallas and the boys were sitting there on the porch waiting for the sun to go down to go to bed. My father had been sent there to play with his cousin, and that's why he was there at the time. My father was staying in one of the houses. And they see the ship sailing in. Now, I didn't believe the story, but I saw the evidence because it's in the Wentworth Museum. And just recently...
Well, go on with the story.
Okay. So the ship is sailing along from west to east, and it puts out right in front of the Uncle Dallas's house, and he's looking at this, and he says, he's got these little boys, and he's thinking, well, what's going on here? So he looks at the ship, it drops anchor, and some men get out into a boat. They put the boat down, a skiff-like boat, and they're carrying something. And, he thought there was. And they start rowing towards the house with lanterns. And so they land on the beach about 100 yards from the house. And I think it's to the east of the house. And some of you all live in that neighborhood. I know who you all live there. And they get out of the skiff with the lanterns, and they start digging.
Could I interrupt?
I'm sorry?
Could I interrupt?
Yeah.
I just did. Anyway, back then, the beach went out a good way. There was a beautiful beach.
You'll see that.
And you'll see the
Yeah,
beach
we'll see
eventually.
the beach here.
But there was a beautiful beach, whereas now there's no beach. It's all riprap and bulkheading. But there was a nice sloping beach, and that's where these people came to.
So they're digging, and my father's Uncle Dallas, he didn't want to let them know they were there because they couldn't see the house back in the woods. So he waited, and eventually they got back in the boat, rowed back to the ship, and the ship took off. So the next morning, Uncle Dallas went with the boys, and he got a shovel to see where they were digging. And he found out where they were digging. And he starts digging, and clang, it hits metal. And he wonders what's going on. Now, I was told the story. I didn't know whether to believe it or not. And so he digs, and he unearths a metal coffin. They opened the coffin up, and what do you think's in the coffin? It wasn't gold. We'd all be rich. But there was a skeleton of a red-haired man in an old-fashioned uniform. So Uncle Dallas says, well, we'll let the poor fellow rest in peace, and he covers him up. And the word gets back to town, and eventually the coffin wound up at the foot of Palafox Pier, and ultimately in the Wentworth Museum. But I didn't know that part until just recently, and then Lucy, about what, how many months ago we went over there?
Oh, about 3 months ago. But also, once the coffin got into Pensacola, and they didn't know what to do with it, they sat it on the end of the Palafox Pier, where it sat for a couple of months. And you go back and you look at the time span, and T.T. Wentworth at that time was about 16 years old. And if you know anything about him, he had started collecting artifacts. He had found in the vicinity of where Project Green Shores is now, he had found a gold coin, and that triggered his interest in old things. And so ultimately he got a hold of this coffin, but before he did, the remains of the gentleman who was in the coffin had been removed, and it was described as a French naval uniform from what year?
1760. Vintage 1760. So the big mystery is,
What happened to him?
did they put it there? Did they know it was there? What's the deal on that? We don't know. We don't know to this day what happened.
So Bob decided a couple of months ago that it would be a good idea to, can y'all hear me? It would be a good idea to write this story up and take it down to the Wentworth Museum, which is now a state museum. And so Bob and I went down there, and the curator was just delightful. He said to me, have you ever seen the coffin? I said, no. I said, is it really real? He said, yes, come on, let's go see it. So we hopped in a car, we went over to their warehouse, went inside the warehouse, and there it was up on a shelf. He wouldn't let me climb up to see it. I don't know why. But at any rate, he took my camera, he took my cell phone up there and shot some pictures of it. And it's a beautifully made old coffin that is probably iron or lead. There's some rust on it, which makes me think iron. And beautiful handles on it. And part of the top of it is bashed in. And they have not had it on display for a long time. Now, it was on display at the time, Nathan, that you and Scott were in high school together. Scott is my older son, who's Nathan's age. And
By the way, Nathan, he didn't believe the story until he saw it.
There's lots of stories.
but at one time, Gulf Breeze Elementary took the kids, including Scott's class, probably 4th grade, when kids study the history of their state. And they went to the museum, and Scott saw the coffin there, and he kept trying to tell the curator and trying to tell his teacher, and he said nobody would listen to him. 19 years old, Anyway, but that's a big mystery. We don't know what happened to the skeleton of the man, but I suspect that he's in a grave at St. Michael's somewhere, an unmarked grave. But who knows?
So, about 1880, James Duncan received a land grant from the federal government for 98 acres here in Gulf Breeze. Most of it was from approximately the Baptist Church to the point, all the way down to the point, which at that time was called Town Point, not Fair Point. We know now that it was called Fair Point, but we always called it Town Point.
Use your microphone. Use your microphone.
Oh, okay. It was, the Duncans called it Town Point, but it was actually Fair Point on the maps. And most of you here probably know that Fair Point Drive was at one time Town Point Road, and that road went all the way down to the point. It was called Town Point Road. And I guess a lot of the Duncans called it Town Point. At any rate,
That name was changed in 1955.
1955, it was changed. I remember that day because I was in the Army and I had to send letters home. And And my parents said, "We're going to have to change the address." And that was about 1955, for what it's worth for you folks recording this. And so James Duncan got this land grant. The Duncans came from Scotland, and they settled in Virginia, and then they went to Kentucky, where they established a plantation, and were doing quite well there, I'm sure. But the Civil War broke out, and that changed things. They were here by 1876 because the oldest grave in the graveyard is 1876, which was my great-great-grandmother. So that's how they came to have the land here. They also got land around the Hoffman's Bayou, quite a number of acres there as well. That's where the first house was built. My great-great-grandfather was Henry S. Duncan. All we know of him is that he had a pilot's license to operate a paddle wheel on the Ohio River in Kentucky. And his descendants were James Duncan, who got the homestead, and he was a bachelor. And his brother Nelson went into the Confederate Army and was in 2nd Duke's Cavalry and Horse Artillery Burn Company, and was captured and sent to Fort Delaware, where he became friends with his jailer. And the jailer's name was Frank McKay, who was a carpenter. And after the war was over, he invited Frank McKay to Town Point and gave him some land. And that is a picture of James Duncan. That's a picture of James Duncan, the original grantee of the homestead. And at any rate, he gave Frank McKay a piece of land, and the house was still standing when we were married. When was that, 1966?
Well, it was in a pretty dilapidated state. It was down within what is now Peaks Point, and his chicken coop was all broken down and everything, but there were parts of that thing there from where Frank McKay lived.
So here's James with all this land. He invites Nelson down to give him some of this land, and Nelson came down, and Nelson had 4 daughters and 3 sons, one of which was my grandfather, George Addison Duncan. And so they ultimately built the 2nd house on the point, and then of course Uncle Dallas built the 3rd house. Now there was only houses in Gulf Breeze until the bridge was built. After the bridge was built, things changed.
By the way, both of these gentlemen are buried in the family cemetery on Fairpoint Drive across from the Baptist Church.
This is Nelson over there, and this is Henry Sanford Duncan. My grandfather, Addison Duncan, who was the son of Nelson, was the captain of the Santa Rosa, which was a Corps of Engineers vessel surveying the new proposed intercoastal waterway from here to Caravel. And Nelson had, as I said, he had 4 daughters and 3 sons, one of which was Dallas, we already discussed that, and one of which was my grandfather, Addison. My grandfather, Addison, died in 1926 in Apalachicola, and he died at the Gibson Hotel. How many people of you all know about the Gibson Hotel? Has anyone stayed there? Okay. Let me tell you this story. Several years ago, we're birders, and we go to St. Mark quite often to bird. And we decided, well, why don't we just stop at the hotel and check it out for a change? We're going through Apalachicola. And so we stopped and we went in, and I saw the concierge, and I said, Would you mind if we look around, because my grandfather died here in 1926 of pneumonia. She said to me, was he a sea captain? I said, yes. I said, he was. How did you know? I said, well, he's still here. Now, whether that was something to romanticize the place, and I don't know, but that's what she said. I go,
Well, she said that people who stay in a particular room and on a particular hallway report seeing a sea captain walking down the hallway, a ghost of a sea captain, so it's a good story.
It may be
Yeah.
to come up with it. Anyway.
Behind Bob,
That's a story of my
behind Bob,
grandfather.
look on the wall behind you.
Right, okay. This is the, as it turns out, this is the second house built in Gulf Breeze. The first one was at the lake house on Hoffman's Bayou, which the Duncans just called the Big Lake. By the way, that lake at one point when they were there was fresh water because they tried to raise goats and the alligators would get the goats. But apparently they chose that to be the first place because it was a shelter for their boats when hurricanes came.
But also, that point of land is called, on all of the maps, that is the point called Town Point. And the point down at the western tip of Gulf Breeze is Fair Point. And so the Duncans settled at the first house at Town Point, but then they had the land grant that encompassed several other parcels and built this house on near the end of Fair Point. And so, not to be confused there.
So, my grandfather died in 1926, leaving my grandmother with all this land and all these kids. She had my father, two sons, and a daughter, and no income. Of course, back in those days, no Social Security, no safety net. So she got the land, so she has to sell the land ultimately. But she sent my father to New Orleans to live with her sister and go to school there, where ultimately my father met my mother, who was from Plaquemine Parish, Louisiana, and I came into being. But they moved back here in 1955. So my memories, we used to come over here on vacation because we had a little cottage up on the bay with a hand pump and an outhouse, and my memories go back to about the late 30s and early 40s. That's as far back as I can go. But I remember how it was. So my grandmother at that point in time had a house on Highway 98 where that Bank of America is now, which at one point was, I think, the City Hall.
It was actually in the fork of the road, you know where the road forks up there close to the highway? And her house was a red brick, moved to
My mother's property.
and it's Teresa's mother's property, that the garage apartment is
I
there
just found
now.
that out, what, yesterday?
I thought he knew it all these years. Anyway, but every now and then check behind me.
Yeah. Okay. All right, here we have Nelson on the left, my great-grandfather, his wife Chloe, and there's James on the right, or the bachelor. This is the Duncan plan, about 1901. The Duncan plan about 1901, and I can identify some of these people. I won't go into that, but apparently that is my grandfather standing up back there, George Addison Duncan, who died in Apalachicola in 1926. That's my grandfather, who, as I say, died in Apalachicola. And that is the Santa Rosa, which was converted from a sailing vessel to steam. But obviously, if you're going to survey that area down there and all those twisting wires and such, you're going to have a power in that sail. As a sailor, I know that. And that was the Santa Rosa. This is about 1913-15, this is the building of the pavilion at the second house near the point. The Duncans decided people would like to come over from Pensacola, sail over, and dance and have fun. So they built a pavilion, and that's the building of the pavilion. And looks like they were living for it. And the pavilion itself, that house stood until about, 10 years ago?
Oh, no.
About 10 years ago when Shirley Adams owned the house, or what was
No,
it? Pavilion.
a section of it.
Section
If you
of it,
look
yeah.
at the part of the house that's in the sunlight with the two windows, that part of the house remained, that part of the pavilion remained until just a few years ago.
Yeah.
And it was owned at that time by Shirley and Owen Adams. And that was ultimately torn down. That property has been sold. It's an odd wedge-shaped piece of property. And it is inside of Peaks Point, inside of the Great Wall. And at any rate, the person who bought the property is having a lot of difficulty because they won't let him build on it because they say that homeowners association are requiring a certain square footage minimum, and the property is not large enough. And so I don't know what will happen.
At any rate, my grandmother, Mary Ann Duncan, and you see a picture of her. Let's just hold this right here, this picture. You'll see a picture of her shortly.
Well, she's there now.
She gave, that's my grandmother on the right, Mary Ann Duncan, and that is Belle Duncan, daughter of Nelson, on the left. And Belle inherited some land from James Duncan down on the point. But my grandmother donated 5 acres of land to the Pensacola Bridge Corporation in 1931 for the right-of-way for the bridge. And that is the clearing of Town Point Road, or Fairpoint Drive, in 1931. And I remember coming down here from New Orleans. We'd come over here on vacation, and my father would have to borrow a shovel because we were never sure that the road was maintained, and sometimes we'd get stuck in a 41 Ford. And so my memory goes back that far. I can also remember during the war when the war broke out, that to get across the bridge, we had to put black tape over our headlights because of the threat of submarines. The Navy or the Army thought they might have submarines looking for silhouettes of ships passing by. So we had to black out our lights getting across the bridge. And we had to be very careful about going fishing in those days. The whole bay, and I mean the whole bay, from Pensacola Beach Bridge all the way to the other bridge, was a big landing strip. I mean, they were constantly landing these two-wing planes, these trainers, and also PBYs, if some of you all know what a PBY is. Who knows what a PBY is? Okay, there's some of the people there. Okay.
Please tell the other people what a PBY is.
PBY is a big seaplane with a pontoon, and it was used for reconnaissance mostly, if I recall. And anyway, the whole bay was nothing but aircraft, and so you had to be careful when you went fishing, because there was an accident where some folks got killed, and there was quite a scandal about it. Anyway, I won't go into the details, but anyway.
That's the last slide.
Huh?
That's the last slide.
Yes.
Yeah, right. It is a little strong, okay. So that's how I came to be here in Gulf Breeze. My parents moved back here in 1955, and I was in the Army at the time. I was serving my time right after Korea, and my earliest recollections go back to the 30s and 40s, and basically that's all I have to present, unless you all have some questions. Yes, ma'am.
Tell them about what my grandmother did to you.
Oh, her grandmother, Marty White, yeah.
Marco, that's my
Of course.
first cousin
Oh,
over
look,
there.
I
It's
used
your
to-
grandmother too.
I used to hunt these woods. I mean, I was always out there with a slingshot or a shotgun trying to find something, and believe me, there was nothing to kill. You got little game now, you got game here now that I never dreamed of when I was a kid. You got coons and possums and foxes. I couldn't find a squirrel. I mean, I'm serious. At any rate, I carried a slingshot around, And I was walking down towards the point one day, it was Clay Road back in those days, and I'm shooting something, maybe a squirrel up in a tree, and Marty White, a couple of grandmothers passing by in a car. She laced me down for that. She was not pleased. Yes, sir.
Did your property go all the way to the point, or if not, how did the peaks get to that point?
The Peaks got it from my people in 1910, and there's a story there that I don't know whether it's true or not. In 1910, the Peaks settled out there. Did we show all the pictures here about
Yeah.
You saw how it was with the long sandy beach, nice beach, and everything was natural until the first groin was put down on our side. Yeah, that's the way it was. This was obviously taken in winter because that's a winter tide, but you can see Peaks cottages way out there on the end, and our homestead was over here. You can see I think you can see the silhouette of the higher house here. And that was the natural beach that I knew as a kid. Of course, now you go out there and it's all rocks, it's all riprap because of the erosion. But what started the erosion was the first groin that was put down by one of the neighbors. And that started the whole process of erosion. The people down that stream, but down on the west side usually lost their sand and they gained more sand. And that started the whole thing, and now it's all rocks. At any rate, any other questions?
So what you were getting at is the property on the point was sold to Ed Peak Sr. in 1910.
Well,
And
now these people are telling me that live on the point that, did you know that Ed Peak got this land over a card game? Now, they told me that just recently, and I said, what? Duncan's never told me anything about that. Maybe they were too embarrassed. But one lady told me that Ed Peak's father won it from Nelson Duncan in the card game.
there's one writer whose last name is Wells. Do any of you all know that book? Who put together some history of North Florida. And in that book, he does state that it was sold by the Duncans to Ed Peak Sr. So
That was 1910.
that's all we know. I
So they
guess
were over
someone
here
could
before the
easily
bridge
go
was
back
built.
to the archives at the county and look it up if they wanted to, if they had a week or two to spend doing that.
Can you tell us more about the pavilion?
I don't know that much about it, except that we have pictures of, you may have shown the picture up here of the people in their old bathing suits.
No, we didn't put that
We
in.
didn't put that in there. Anyway, we have pictures of ladies in their long dresses and hats and around the turn of the century.
And bathing suits that went from the knees to the neck.
And they went over there to dance, and I would imagine they had music, but I'm not sure. But they did have to sail over there before the bridge was built.
Did you ever hear your father or grandfather talk about moonshining in the region, or
Moonshine?
moonshining?
Oh, yes, I'm going to tell you the story here. This must have been 1926, during the 1926 hurricane. The Duncans being the only ones over there, all the fishermen in the bay, when the hurricane was coming and things were getting tough, they'd go to the Duncans and put their skiffs and boats into the lake for protection. And my father said, the night of the hurricane, the wind was so strong, the house was lifting up off its foundation. And the wind was coming from the woods, actually. But the fishermen were all drunk on their moonshine. That's pretty terrible. So here we was that. But I'm sure they had a few stills around there someplace. Anybody else?
One last question. I understand that there were also a lot of free-range cattle in the area that you...
Oh, yes. When I was a kid, I told you I used to hunt these woods. There was a cattle trail that ran from the point all the way through Live Oak. And I'd take that cattle trail to go hunting down around Deer Point, which was really wild at the time. And the cattle, until the stop laws were passed around 1950, because we ran, my parents bought my aunt's lot where we live now, which was called Duncan's Beach Cabins, and people would come to stay. There were only 3 places to stay as of around 1948. Shady Shores Cottages, Gulf Breeze Cottages, and Duncan's Beach Cabins. We only ran those in the summertime because we lived in New Orleans. And my job was to run the cattle and the pigs out, because they would come into the lot at night, and get them out of houses, and they'd squeal and make a big fuss. And of course, no one wants to stay in a house, and you got pigs underneath. So my job was to do that. That was, the stop law was passed around 1950. And I put an end to that, because you could be driving on Highway 98 and there's a cow in the middle of the road at night, you know, it was quite dangerous.
I do have one more question.
Okay.
And it went right over my head and went away. But talking about cows, we were talking about, over on the sound side used to be a Confederate hospital, I believe, or a lookout tree that was over there. Do you remember climbing that as a boy, or hearing anyone talk about that?
No, I remember the fire tower. There was a fire tower at Sunset and Shoreline. In fact, somebody just called me about that. There was a fire tower, and it was used as a lookout for the Navy during the war, because they would drop practice bombs out in the bay. They'd have a wooden target out in the bay, and then they'd drop these little wooden bombs. It didn't explode. I mean, and I was elated. I'd go around picking up bombs when I was a kid. So, yes.
We had a speaker, this has been a few months ago, talking about the naval live oaks area, and he mentioned there was an elephant buried there. Have you ever heard of that story?
An elephant?
An elephant, yes. Apparently someone had a small zoo and the elephant died and they buried it somewhere in the naval live oaks.
No, but you're talking about a hospital, whereabouts?
There was this is during the war between the states, Civil War.
Okay.
So it would be out on what I used to call Deer Point, but it's on the south side of the sound, into the sound. There used to be a lake there also years ago.
Never, don't know anything about that. No. I was in the cemetery one day cleaning it up, and we maintained it as a bird sanctuary, and I maintained the graves, but 4 times a year I go in and do that, and maintain the rest as a bird sanctuary. But I was in there one day cleaning up, and this young fellow from the university came by, an archaeologist, and I was telling him about the history of the area, and he said there was a French naval hospital in the vicinity of the cemetery on the bay. And I didn't know anything about that, but thinking about the naval uniform, 1760 French vintage, what? I don't know.
What about schools during your grandfather's time?
There were no schools.
Children in your family.
The cemetery was dedicated as a school and supposedly given to the county. The county reneged and never did build a school, and so the Duncans used it as a cemetery, because there were already graves there.
Which is why the county didn't want it for a school area.
There are 3 graves in the cemetery, and there were cypress crosses there when I was,
Well, when we married in 1966, there were several small, if you could call it headstones, but they were made out of cypress. They were about yay thick, and they were about that wide, and stood about that far up above the ground. And they were pretty well eroded out, but it had CSA on it, for Confederate States of America. And so those were there in the southwest corner of the cemetery. And that's close to the Turner property now.
And if you go into the cemetery, to those graves, there are depressions where obviously the coffins have collapsed, and you can see about 3 undulating depressions like that. So apparently something is there. Somebody is there, whether it's French or Confederate, I don't know.
We do keep the cemetery gate locked, and the reason is we've had vandalism in there. And so, you know, if some of you all wanted to go in and see the cemetery, you need to touch base with us, and we'll make it happen for you. But one thing that I would like to mention...
Go ahead, just a minute. One thing, you can see all the brush on the road that hides the cemetery. We want it that way. And the road gang came in once, thinking they were doing us a favor, they cleared it out, and the cemetery was obvious, and then we started to have vandalism. So now we have it with the brush. Yes, sir?
What was your connection with the Turners?
The Turners? None whatsoever.
None?
No, they came over apparently after the bridge was built. Well, everybody else came over after the bridge was built, yeah. Anything else? We're over our time.
I wanted to say one thing. When you saw the slide that showed Bob's grandmother, Mary Ann Duncan, and Chloe Bell Duncan Lewis, did you notice the vegetation on the side of the road? It was scrawny, it was pathetic, it was low. And you know, back then, wildflowers would rip through an area and take out things, but nowadays, we suppress wildfires, not wildflowers. Yeah, the city does repress and get rid of wildflowers too by mowing the sides of the road. But another pet peeve of mine.
We're over around half hour, I think.
Yeah, but let me finish this, please.
Yes. Go ahead.
And anyway, Bob has said that when he was a kid, he could actually climb a pine tree or some tree across the street from our house and see all the way out into the Gulf. That's how low the vegetation was.
Now, we live on the north side. But when I used to go hunting, there was one area, the area I avoided was called the Big Flat. And that was an area from approximately the Methodist Church to the Baptist Church, and north of Shoreline Drive. It was just flat, and it was cactus and scrub oaks and Bay Air sand, and when it rained a lot, there were little standing puddles of water and ponds. It was low. The Duncans didn't want it. That was the Anderson tract. Nobody wanted it. That's why they didn't put a fence around it and then claim it as a homestead. But who wanted it? But anyway, it was low, and so that's why that area has problems with drainage.
Well, thank you so much for coming.
I was just curious about the bridge. What you're saying, I'm interpreting as though as the bridge came across to to Town Point, or was it where it always is now?
Always where it is.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. I wasn't interpreting that correctly.
All right, let's give a big round of applause.